During WWDC 2023, a new data persistence framework was introduced, which is SwiftData. After the time that I'm recording this, it is still in beta and available if you use Xcode 15 and want to ship apps for iOS 17, macOS 14. And in this tutorial, I give you an introduction to SwiftData, what it actually is, how to use it, and what are the advantages. SwiftData allows you to store and manage data on the device. You can also use iCloud Sync to share data between different devices. This works for a private database. A lot of the advantages have to do with the way we write the model files. So now you can write in Swift your models with Swift native types. You can choose more about if you want to work with options or non-optionals. You can also easier store enums and custom types. It also is meant to work with SwiftUI. You can't use it with UIKit. In order to show you all this amazingness, I'm now going to show you a basic example for SwiftData. And for this, we need to create a new project. This is an iOS-only application. And as usual, we start with a to-do app. New with Xcode 15, you have now another option for storage. So you can choose non-core data and now the new SwiftData. I'm going to use this. It generated one model file for us, which is called item, and populated a little sample list here. If you don't see the Xcode preview, don't worry. There's still quite some problems when working with Xcode previews that use SwiftData. I'm going to make another video just for the previews because I'm guessing this will update quite a bit. Okay, now let's start by the first big part of SwiftData, which is the model definitions. So we look at the one example they gave us. First, we have to import SwiftData. Then we are declaring here our own type, which is this item. With SwiftData, we have to use classes. This is because SwiftData relies on one more new feature for iOS 17 and macOS 14 that was also introduced during the same time, which is the new observation feature, which I did another video about. If you want to work with SwiftData, definitely have a watch because it helps you a lot in setting up the data flow for your apps. This new feature is very nice because it makes it easier to pass data, and it also is more efficient because it's optimized to not update things too often. We have here one property declared inside. All properties that are declared inside will be stored in your SwiftData. You can also tell it to ignore some of these properties. And because I work here with a class, we have to write our own initializer. Now, the amazingness of SwiftData comes with a lot of macros, another new Swift feature. And in this case, we're using the add model macro. This small declaration does a lot of things for us. And I'm just going to try and open the help so you see what is in there. So below the macro model, there is the persistent model information, because this is the one that is actually also added to our model files. And here you see this is the new observation. This is what I just mentioned. Then this is hashable and also identifiable. So you don't need to additionally add identifiable. This is also done for you. Behind the scenes, they add an object identifier. It's not super convenient to work with this by yourself because of this, whatever type this is. All of these protocol conformances make it very easy to work with SwiftUI. For the data flow for access. Additionally, when you add this add model, it will know how to create a schema from your models that is then stored in an SQLite database on this device. If I would now want to continue defining here my model, I guess because I said we are making a to-do app, I'm first going to rename this. Rename to-do. So we have here a timestamp. What I actually want to have is probably the creation date. Also going to rename this creation date. When I create a new to-do, I want to automatically set the creation date to the current date, which I'm doing it in initializer, so I don't need to pass this here. Then I want to have a name string. This one I don't want to have in the init and set it to my name property. We can continue working here and set a isDone property. This is a bool. As you see, I can very easily work with native types. isDone bool. And this one, the default for a new to-do is probably not done yet, so this is false as the default value. We can also use numbers, like for example, the priority is an int, and I can set the priority also in the initializer int with a default of 0, and then set this here. Additionally, if you don't have types that are Swift native types, for example, if you want to store an image, this is usually done with a data. So var image is a data, optional. Now, a lot of the times you want to even further customize how this is stored in the database, and for this you have the possibility to use another macro, which is add attribute. And for example, I can say external storage. For me right now with the beta, it's not working. You're not supposed to put large amounts of data in the database, and in this case it tells it to separately store it in an extra file. But for you as a developer who accesses the data from the database, it doesn't make a difference. You can easily extract it from just this image property. Other attributes is, for example, you can say something is unique. If you would try to insert another object with the same creation date, it would just overwrite the existing one and update its properties with the one that you just set. This also has things for transient if you don't want to actually store it in the database, or encrypted. You can also do stuff like original name. For example, if you previously had this with a different title, you can rename properties also with this attribute. I'm going to just go back to the unique one. Then a lot of the times with databases you have more than just one file, and for this example I'm just going to quickly here generate another class, which is a tag with just a name property string, again adding here an initializer, final, this is because we can't subclass, and then adding again the model macro. Now let's say I want to create a relationship between this to-do and these tags. I can simply declare this relationship as another property of tags. This is an array of tag, optional. There's still a problem with the relationship and optional handling. So a to-do can have many tags, so that's why I'm using here an array. And from the tags perspective, I can say var to-dos. So the to-dos that this tag is attached to, again, can be many. So I can add another to-do array, optional. If you use here types that are classes, it will generate a relationship in the database. If you use here value types, structs, it will store them as values in the database. For example, if I want to store a color, I would create my own custom type. This is now my RGB color with 4 values, red, green, blue, and alpha, with a default initializer, and one that uses a SwiftUI color, where I get the red, green, blue, and alpha channels and set them here to my values. And another convenience function which takes these values and generates me a SwiftUI color. The important thing now for SwiftData is that this has to conform to Codable. A very typical thing in Swift to store to the file system to use with networking with URL session. So this now is my type that I can use as one of my properties, var color RGB color. And now I can also add this here in my initializer, RGB color self dot the color is the new color. When this property is stored, it is using Codable to generate a data blob and then store this data blob in the database. So again, something very convenient that we don't have to think about a lot about how our data is actually stored, because everything is done by SwiftData. What we only have to do is write our own Swift types that we are used to. Now, just to make this a little bit nicer in my project, I'm creating here a model group, and I'm going to move this in a separate file. One for tag. Again, I need to import in this SwiftData, and then maybe also I'm going to move the RGB color type. And in this file, I only need to import SwiftUI for working here with UI colors and SwiftUI color. Okay, now that I have here my model files, we need to look at how the project is set up to actually work with SwiftData. So I go to my main app file, and here is one line which says model container for to-dos valve. In SwiftData, in order to work with your data, there's two main components. One is the container that I need to set up once for my whole project. The container is responsible for taking the data that you generated and actually save it to a file, or when you launch your application, it needs to fetch the data from the file. When we create our project the first time, it needs to actually generate a database file with the correct configurations. And part of this configuration is needing to know what tables to generate, what data is actually stored. So it needs to know a schema for this. And for an Excel sheet, what kind of columns do we need to store? And in this case, we are saying we're having data, generate a table for to-dos. If you have multiple types, we will need to write here an array of to-do, and we want to store tag.self, so we need to declare the types that we want to store. And for each of these tags, it would generate a schema. If you have types that are in relationship to others, like here my to-do has a relationship to tags, when I want to store this, it obviously needs to have this type also in the database. So SwiftData is smart enough to automatically also understand it needs to generate a tag schema too. That's why it's usually, most of the time you have related objects, so one of them is enough. Now when I say to do, it also generates the tag one. This is a convenient way of generating a container. Sometimes you also want to do more configuration of how you want to work with your data. For example, if I want to use iCloud Sync, I would need to here also tell the configuration to use iCloud Sync. And the container name, so we would need to use another modifier where you pass in a container. Then another thing with these containers is the SwiftUI preview, because I need to, here in my preview, work with different ones. And you see it generates a model container and uses the additional argument of in-memory true. So if you, for example, add something in the previews, some data, it wouldn't persist this, and the next time you launch it, you would start fresh. Ideally, you want to generate previews with some dummy data, so we see something. I'm not going to do this in this demo because it's a little bit tricky. Okay. Once you set up all your model containers, Xcode understands to go and generate a schema from all your model classes, and then generates a database and fetches the data and stores the data when you say so. SwiftData is very conveniently set up so that whenever you create or change something in your data, one of your to-dos, it automatically saves it when you have an UI update. For example, when you change something and your view updates, it will save it. So you don't need to think of saving it continuously, so that when the next time your app launches, the data is still there. Okay, now let's have a look at my little problem here. In the content view, there's a function add item where we generate a new to-do. So let's have a look at how to generate this. I can generate a new to-do. Once you generate one, in order to actually persist it, you need to insert it into the model context. The model context is the second part for working with SwiftData. This is the interface where you can work with your data. The model context is connected to your container. Basically, the model context is the access point for you to fetch data, generate data, create data, delete data, update things. And then SwiftData over the model context tracks changes automatically. And when the system calls save, this temporary data in the model context is then transferred via the container to actually save it to the file. So the heavy lifting of working with the actual database is done with the container, and we don't have to touch this. Everything is done with the context. Because I set up here my model container, it generates an attached context, which I can access from the environment over the model context property. You will see a lot of examples with working with the context. Okay, now I have here my container, I have my context, and I can generate new to-dos with the initializer that we wrote, and then add it to the model context. This is one part. The second part is actually how do I get my data? How do I read my data? And for this, we have a query where we can say what we want to fetch from the type. So this is an array of to-dos that I want to fetch. I'm just going to rename this to-dos. When you add here a query, it fetches it and uses the model context. Usually, you could also use directly the model context fetch, where you can say what you want to fetch here and how you want to fetch this. But this would only fetch it once, and we want to continuously fetch things and always have the right data in this array of to-dos, so that when I press here plus, this to-dos array gets the new data. So let's try this. If I press here plus, I'm calling the add item function, which then generates a new to-do and adds it to the model context. This then is registered with this query, standing query, updates my to-dos array that then tells the list in my view for each of the to-do that we now have a new to-do, and shows a new text. So if I press this button, we get this new cell. There's a lot of things automatically happening, and all we need to actually do is insert it in the model context and work with this at queries. Now you saw how to create a new object, but how do you delete one or remove it? And the sample project I used here on delete, which is swipe on delete, this is implemented with this delete function, where we get the offset, and we're using this to-dos array at this index. This is then the to-do that is supposed to be deleted. And similar to inserting a new object with the model context, we again ask the model context to delete this object. So this is very straightforward. Model context, delete the item that we had from our swipe on delete. Then from the CRUD operations, so create, read, delete, and update, we are still missing one, which is updating an item. I'm not going to do this here in this list. I'm going to create a detail view, which is a SwiftUI view, detail to-do view. And what I need here is a to-do. The previews have some problem, so I'm going to uncomment this for now, because this would exceed this introduction a little bit. I can use this detail now here as the destination for my navigation link. Detail to do for this. I'm just going to rename this to do. Now when I create one of them and I go to the detail, we have here something. And since we have a to-do item, let's just display some of the properties that we added for this object. So we have the to-do's name. I'm not going to use the to-do's creation date, but we have the is done and the priority. I probably don't want to show here is done. I want to actually show an image. System name, so that when this is done, I show a different icon than when I have to do this. So looking for checkmark.circle.fill, and otherwise I just use a circle. This I probably also want to have with a foreground color. I'm going to use the newer foreground style. Again, I'm using the is done property. To say if it's done, I use green, and if not, I use gray. This I'm also going to add to my list just to make it a little bit nicer. So here in this text, I use a HTag. Now when I generate this, I have this indicator. So far not so interesting. What I actually want to do here is allow the user to change some of these properties, for example, the to-do's name. So here, instead of a text, I want to show a text field, to do, new to-do. And I need to use here a binding to a string property. We want to use the to-do's name. Now this is obviously not a binding, so we need to change the way I declare this to-do here. And I already mentioned that SwiftData uses the new observation feature. So this is the new data flow, which has one new property wrapper, which is at bindable, not at binding, at bindable var to do, which is allowing me now to use here binding to my text field, adding a little bit of text field styling of rounded border, and adding here a padding. I can use these bindable now also to generate here a toggle with the binding to the to-dos is done. I'm guessing I'm using this here, the to-do is done property to say done or open. Okay, let's test this and see if I can change my properties. Again, I create here a dummy one. I go to the detail. Now I can tap on this text field and say buy milk. And I can also change this here to being done. Now when I go back, you see this little icon is updated to show that it's actually done. I probably also should show the name here. So this is these labels. I'm going to add a VStack. Alignment of leading to show the texts, to do name, and then the creation date I'm going to leave below. Again, buy milk, done. Going back, now both of these properties updated. For convenience, I'm going to add here a subview for this, which is the to-do row. This needs to have a to-do object. Again, the preview that I'm not going to use that much. Now I can use my little view in here. I'm uncommenting this otherwise. Okay, now this is my to-do raw for this to-do. As you see here, from this view, I have detailed to-do's view which just passes the to-do in both cases, also for the to-do raw. Only that for the to-do detail view, I declared this here with this add binder mill, so I can change it in this view. This makes it very easy because I don't need to add here bindings two for each. One of the advantages for the new observation feature. Okay, as you see, it's super easy to update something. You can also simply set a property in code. For example, I'm just going to add one tag as a test. So again, I need to generate a tag, dummy tag with a color 1001. And I can add the to-do's tags. Here, this new tag. And I also want to show this in a HStack text tags for each of my to-do's tags. I'm going to show the a text with the tag's name. And I also want to show you that we actually saved the color. Before, it's complaining that we are working here with an array of optionals. So I'm going to say if it's optional nil, then use an empty array. Now I'm adding a little bit of padding and an overlay with a rounded rectangle of corner radius 5, and I'm using stroke with the tag color to SwiftUI colors and a line width of 2. So testing this. In this case, I'm just building the project. Adding here items, going to the detail, and then I add here a tag and you see it appears. I can also add here multiple of them. As you see, I simply needed to generate a new tag instance and then add it as a property to my to-do's tag list. In this case, I also didn't have to insert it into the model context because it automatically, once you connect two of these objects and one is already inserted, the other one is also inserted in the context. Similarly, if you want to remove these connections, I can say, okay, this is just really a short example. On tab gesture, if I want to remove this tag, I can say the to-do tags remove, because this is an array operation, I need to use index. If let index is the to-do's tags first index where this is equal to my tag. Now I have an index and I can remove this from this array. Adding here the optional. Okay, try again. I relaunch my application. As you see, my data is still there. Go to the detail, my tags are still there. And now if I tap, I removed these ones. I removed the connection or the relationship between them. This tag is still in the database. You just have to be careful with these arrays here because they make the impression that they're ordered. Unfortunately, this is not keeping the order where you appended them. So if you want to keep a certain order, you would need to reorder them. For example, here when I show this, I would need to use sorted by .name. So now I would sort them by name. Okay, this is my very simple example not happening because I only generate here one type. But you get the idea that this is a little bit tricky so far and misleading. But this brings me to another topic, which is actually working with these at query. I didn't do that so far because we just didn't have any data that is more interesting. In this list now, when I press here plus, it generates a new element and it appends it at the end of this list. But if I add more and more, the user won't see that they added one, so I would actually prefer to change the sort order. Maybe even allow to sort by the name, not just the creation date. Or to do some extra filtering here for only showing the ones that are done or not done yet. And for this, query has a lot of tricks. And the first one is actually the sorting, where you can define the key path or the property to sort this, like the creation date. If I have a look at this query, see here all the things that are available. There's the sort that I just used, and there's also the order. The default is forward, and I can also use reverse. This might not work so right now. Let's see. So if I add a new one, it should add it at the beginning. So I just need to check which time I have. And it actually does this. One thing that right now is annoying me is that the changes don't happen with an animation. In order to use the animation, I need to use a different query. So starting again from a query, sort and animation. So this is an array of sort descriptors, starting with init, key path and order. So this is pretty much the same as I had before with the reverse order. And now I can use the animation to bouncy. Private var to-dos. I'm just going to uncomment the previous one. So now if I press, it animates this nicely in, and we see where it actually appears. Delete is also nicer animated. Unfortunately, they did this differently here with these animation blocks. They don't really do anything. So I'm just going to remove them. Try again. Animating nicely. And we made our logic here simpler. That's always good. Okay, now we had the sorting. You can also add here multiple sorting styles. This is, for example, if two of them have the same thing. For example, I can sort this here by the to-do is done property, which is one thing that does not currently work. So I'm just going to remove this. Or the to-do's name property. Just need to change something. So now the first one is sorting by the name. Two of them have the same ones, and they are then using the creation date for sorting. Now I want to shortly show you filtering. This is also a new Swift feature because it's using for the predicates a new predicate macro. Okay, again starting with a query, filter, and going down, pressing right arrow, going down to filter, sort, and animations. Yeah, let's do this. And you see here I have a predicate. So this is hashtag predicate. Right now I need to specify for which type, which is a to-do. Then here you can define what kind of to-do you want to show. For example, I want to show not done to-dos. I think I can also write it like this. Okay, then sorting, let's just keep the sorting I had before. Animation, bouncy, private var remaining to-dos. So for now I'm going to add here another section of my remaining to-dos, and again I just show here this to-do raw. I'm adding here. Okay, also add a section title. Still not done. Okay, now if I add here one, I add them to both of them. If I just finish one of them, and I go back, you see the first section, this one. I'm just going to add a section around it too. All to-dos. So we have two sections. I add one that is not finished. I then finish this. and now it's only in one of the sections. So the first one, I fetch everything. I don't add, because I didn't add a filter. And in the second, I said I only want the ones that are not done yet. So this property should be false. And we see we only get the two that are for this. This is just a preview refreshing. So again, I finished one that I then filter out in my section where I only show the one that are not done yet. Working with this new predicate macro is very promising. As you see, I can just describe this in Swift code. Unfortunately, there's a lot of problems with this declaration, especially for relationships and certain types of properties. So we see maybe by the time you're watching, this is already fine. Okay, I hope I gave you some idea of where SwiftData is going in the future, with a lot of advantages regarding the model definition, where we can easily work with our own types. I here even use the custom types. Right now it doesn't work for enums properly, that's why I didn't show you, but you're supposed to be also easily just using here, being able to use your enum. For example, for my priority, I would want to use an enum of low priority, high priority, medium priority. Then I walked you through how to set up the SwiftData storage with basically this one line of defining the model so that your app knows what container to use. We then just had a look at all the different operations working with data that work with the model context, which we need to create new objects, to delete objects. When you want to update data, you can simply change one of the properties, like I did here for adding a new tag property. If you want to use one of the SwiftUI binding views, like a text field, you can just have a look at the observation framework and use here this the bindable, which is a very small addition to what you get for it. Whenever something changes in your context, one of your objects is created or updated, SwiftUI's updating cycle when a new view is created is used to automatically call save on the context. You can also disable this if you don't want to, but I don't think you would want to. Just it does everything automatically, which is very nice. And then lastly, I showed you a little bit about how to fetch data with more advanced features like here sorting and this filtering. Right now, I would probably not recommend to use SwiftData in a production app. One reason, it's only available for the newer iOS 17 and macOS 14. And the other one is there's quite a lot of features missing in comparison to core data. And there's also quite a few bugs. If you're a new developer for Swift, you might not know about this, but always have a look at the release notes. So this is for Xcode release note, and then just you go to Xcode beta, and to have here a look, for example, for the preview problems, and then look at the iOS beta release notes and search for SwiftData. For example, here you see that there's only one resolved issue and quite a few things that are unresolved. A lot of the times they give you suggestions how to fix this. For example, I here had to explicitly say what predicates type you're working with, or here also with the key paths. So this is here the to-do name. Usually a shortcut would have been just to say the to-do type's name property. This is a little bit buggy right now. You can also see, for example, the information of external storage does not properly work right now, or here there's a problem with enums, or at query sometimes doesn't show the correct data. These are quite a few big problems. I hope they're going to fix this. So just regularly, when there's a new beta, have a look here to get an idea. This is usually what I do first, otherwise I get quite confused and frustrated. It's simply because sometimes things don't work as expected, and this is going to save you some time and understanding what's going on. If you like SwiftData so far and you want to actually build a little bit more with it and explore some of the other features, I'm going to build a larger project with SwiftData. So this is a little snippet app or note-taking app where we also explore more of these relationships and data types. So go watch that if you want to continue with SwiftData. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video if you found it helpful and want to see more. Until next time, happy coding!